Welcome everybody. This is our first roundtable at our GreenDeal-NET conference today. And what we want to talk about today is, as Sebastian just said, this idea of backlash, challenge, a moment that's quite disruptive, quite difficult for many, many reasons, but also including environmental governance. So democracy on thin ice, climate and sustainability policy backlash, and the legitimacy challenge in the EU. My name's Louisa Parks. I'm a professor in political sociology at the University of Trento in northern Italy. I'm part of GreenDeal-NET, and it's been a fabulous 3 years. And one of the things that we've been talking about, again as Sebastian was just telling you, is democracy and the European Green Deal. Is there anything new? Are there new openings to democracy? How do we need to foster, invent, reinforce, reuse ideas of democracy that we have and create democratic innovations to ensure that whatever kind of Green Deal or transition or transformation or radical change, with these things look different to different people, how can we do that democratically, inclusively, and in a way that fosters environmental justice? So we put out a special issue on that in the Journal of European Integration, which is, I should say, also open access. So if you want to have a look at anything in there, there are no paywalls there. You can get into that for free, which I edited with Diarmid Turney, who's there, and Aaron Butsogani, who is maybe online somewhere. And what we tried to talk about in that work were, where are the new areas of democracy? Where are the challenges? All of these questions. But as is the way with academic publishing, what we've talked about is perhaps already out of date by the time we've got through peer review, etc. So what we want to talk about today is exactly this moment, right? This moment of disruption, or increasing disruption that's maybe always been there, but the fact that we are seeing, on one hand, maybe less attention to climate, environment, biodiversity, policy, etc., perhaps because it looks less urgent in a climate where there are very immediate and urgent things that appear to gain our attention perhaps a little bit more easily, but also where we're seeing the continuing rise of power of different groups in society that challenge climate action. In a European context, maybe not so much flat, outright climate denialism, but competition about what should we do, how, when, with how much money, etc. So what are we going to do? How are we going to move forward democratically in this kind of context? So we've got a great panel here today to help us talk about some of those issues. So online we have Karin Bäckstrand, and I'm going to just do a blanket apology for my poor pronunciation of people's names. Bäckstrand, there, we'll give it a go. Okay. Karin is, of course, Professor in Environmental Social Science at Stockholm University, and also a Senior Researcher at the Institute for Future Studies. And as I'm sure many of you know, her extensive work revolves around global environmental politics, EU climate politics, democratic legitimacy and global governance, and much, much more, including lots of fabulous work on non-state actors in climate governance. Remaining online, we also have Camila Pels, who is an expert in how we can advance evidence-based climate action and EU governance, and she is an expert in the Secretariat to the European Scientific Advisory Board on climate change. She also does work on EU climate and energy policy analysis, and holds a PhD in law. Moving into the room, we have Frederick Harpen over here, Senior Policy Officer for Environmental Law and Democracy at the European Environmental Bureau. And he does a lot of work on the Aarhus Convention, I believe, so access to information, access to justice, participation in decision-making, and he also does work on environmental crime. And then we finally, last but not least, we have Ben Ersü. Okay, Ersü. Okay, Executive Director of G1000, and this is a Belgian platform for democratic innovation. So again, really important voice to have here today. Thank you so much for coming. And they work with governments and societal actors to better include citizens in policy making, something very much close to my own heart. So I'm looking forward to that. And he's been involved in various citizens' dialogues, citizens' assemblies, including the Permanent Assembly on the Climate in the city of Brussels. Now, without further ado, I'm going to move on. We're going to have a round of slightly more in-depth questions, different questions to each of our speakers. Then I'm going to ask each speaker to make a quick, sort of snappy, final, debate-provoking statement about what we can do at the moment. But I wanted to start with Karin online and ask Karin to share her thoughts about where we've, what in the recent past we've managed to do in the EU. So how have the EU institutions, and the democratic institutions in particular, and its member states, what's the balance? How have we fared on climate and environmental questions and democracy in recent years? Thanks, Karin.
Thank you, Louisa, and thanks for the invitation to this extremely important and timely panel. And your question, which is really a million-dollar question that I thought a lot about, not only recently but for long. So I'm actually going to, since we are in very dark times, I want to start in a positive note. I think we can say pretty confidently that EU is the largest and most far-reaching experiment in transnational or supranational democracy. So skeptics of democracy beyond the nation state or critics of cosmopolitan democracy even have to admit that EU succeeded in this. So what we have here is an electoral democracy at the supranational level with the European Parliament that has also, and I come back to the environment, is actually the largest, in EU we have the most far-reaching environmental and sustainability legislation of any any IO in the world. And even in times of geopolitical turbulence, disruption, war, polycrisis, we had last year an election to the European Parliament. We can talk about shifts, and we come back to backlash, rolling back of climate policy, but EU is resilient even in times where there is an enormous threat to democracy with the rise of authoritarian populism, nationalism, ideological polarisation and military aggression. I think my overall scorecard, and I'm sure we can debate that more, is that the EU is pretty resilient. Now, with, of course, looming threats. My second point, and it comes to climate sustainability and environmental governance. What we have seen here, even if we have had these disruptive era since COVID and now with the war, is that the field of climate and sustainability and environmental governance has been a virtual laboratory for democratic innovation in the EU, but also at the multilateral and national level. We have seen in the EU novel democratic mechanisms such as citizen participation mechanisms to include stakeholder, citizen panels, consultation. We see recently the European Climate Pact, a way to institutional citizen participation. And we can discuss and argue whether these are democratic, the quality of these. Is this more lip service, cosmetic participation? That's a challenge with all deliberative and participatory mechanisms. However, I think experimenting with democracy is part of democracy. And I would argue, as you, Louisa, put on this, I should try to do a scorecard, that the space for citizen participation has overall increased in the European Union and is a cornerstone of the European Green Deal that I come back to. And there has been an institutionalization of democratic also proceduralism with creating stronger, which many here research on, stronger accountability and transparency of climate and environmental policy mechanism. And I think EU is on the forefront of that. A third dimension that I think cannot be enough underlined in these very disruptive times is EU's role as a global actor, how it acts for democracy and sustainability in its external division. For very long, for decades, EU have been a champion of global as a global leader and for a very strong voice in multilateral climate and environmental summits, have pushed for these, and also for democratic innovation as a democracy promotion, an agent for democracy promotion, and for the model of liberal multilateralism that is under enormous pressure. But still, I would say this role is extremely important in this time. Many IR scholars call these soft powers, but to push for its issues now, also with 5 years only left to Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, where EU has been very active in multilateral summits. This is an extremely important role in this time when there is when US and MAGA actually retreat from many countries. So that kind of soft power on democracy and environmental and sustainability issue is very important. But we see here a paradox today in, I would say, EU and elsewhere. On one hand, we see democratic backsliding, recession, ideas of illiberal democracy, autocratization on the rise. And my colleagues in political science in the VDEM project talk about the autocratization, where we now have a majority of the world states are authoritarian, and we see a retreat of democracy. This, of course, has enormous impact for EU that also has its own internal trouble with illiberal democracy, such as in Hungary, an attack on the rule of law. We see this autocratization within, and so that is definitely on the scorecard very negative. But there is this paradox, because on the other hand, we see, which I said in the beginning, the deepening of novel experiments with democratic innovation in the field of EU climate and sustainability. And number of procedural mechanisms, public participation in impact assessment, consultation with citizens in EU's program on environmental action. We see this mechanism to increase citizens in the drafting of national energy and climate plans. And again, the climate pact and climate ambassador. So there is this growing institutionalization of citizen and civil society participation, along with EU's, along with that EU has to operate in an increasingly illiberal world. And another point that I wanted to try to capture, and I hope we can discuss more, is the European Green Deal, because and that relationship to democracy, which was part of the special issue that Sebastian talked about. So EU aspires to be the first carbon neutral continent in the world by 2050, and the European Green Deal, I think it's enormous reform package to decarbonize society, but it has to be done with the support and trust on citizens in very difficult time. And I would say that this is the $1 million question. How can you decarbonize a society, an EU, in a democratic way, gaining trust of citizens and gaining their support in this very disruptive time with existing crises such as cost of living, recession, and climate crisis. So I think I see the Green Deal as a project of both societal, democratic, and sustainability transformation. And skeptics of environmental democracy, that you actually can have a climate environmental democracy, or proponents of eco-authoritarian approaches, they have argued that democracy is too slow and cumbersome to handle this, and that EU cannot do that. But I actually here in the face of mounting empirical evidence say that those critics are wrong. We can see that in extremely difficult time with the COVID and the security threat, EU has hold on to the European Green Deal as the largest reform packet ever for transforming and decarbonizing EU. And with Fit for 55. While there is definitely, and I'm happy to come back to that, bumps in the road and setbacks, the overall picture is that EU navigates well to tackle policy crisis, the intersecting threats of climate change, biodiversity loss, energy security, and war. While we see definitely a rollback and even policy dismantling, maybe more in many member states, the European polls and barometer indicates that European citizens rank climate change, the threat of climate change, as very high and rank it as very important. And it also shows European citizens that there is a robust support for EU in tackling climate change. However, EU is far from perfect in handling this, and we see definitely a backlash, which the title indicates of this panel. And I also want to mention, which we will come back to, I'm very curious to hear about how just transition, which I think is a central feature of democracy, has been able to address the distributional issues related to decarbonization and how groups will not be left behind. EU has also experimented with a number of mechanisms to handle that. Nevertheless, I need to, of course, say now, so I'm not framed as this enormous, unrealistic optimist, that the European Green Deal, and whether it's democratic or not, is rightly not without its critics. We see a lot of symbolic participation, emphasis very much on growth and economic growth, and other values than democracy. And the big question, and I want to I don't know how many, I think I don't have many minutes left, Louisa.
No, we need to move on to other questions quite soon.
And then I'm going to end with saying that I think, to answer your question, EU fares pretty well in terms of participation through these institutional mechanisms to involve citizens. However, I think we need to keep an eye that these orchestrated mechanisms are not enough. We need bottom-up social movements for enhancing democratic quality. And then I also think, to end with a little bit pessimistic note, but I hope I can develop some more, that my biggest worries are the hurdles of both to democracy and decarbonization. First, that climate and security concerns are crowding out. Security concerns are crowding out climate. That we see a trend of climate policy dismantling, rollback, and climate policy delay. And we also see an increased, since election of Trump, increased rise in polarisation, authoritarian populism, and an attack on the very values of liberal multilateralism that EU stands for. And so to finalize, I think this scoring EU on democracy and climate change, it's still a very uncertain outcome, but I choose to be a bit more optimistic here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Karin. So, moving on from that sort of scorecard of resilient, quite institutionalized, still holding up sort of classical and some new institutionalizations of different types of democracy, but a growing sort of outside and inside kind of a threat to those kinds of ideas. And of course that theme of crowding out, which I think is very important. I'd like to come into the room now and ask both Frederik and Ben to talk about what else we need. What are the other sources of democratic innovation or maybe more classical democracy, let's say, to take long-term approaches to climate and environmental challenges properly into account, to do this just transition, this decarbonisation in an inclusive way that Karin was talking about. I don't know what order you want to go in. Up to you. Okay.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for having me here today. So I work for the European Environmental Bureau, and we're a network. We are close to 200 members, member organizations across the EU, and that's also, I think, part of the answer that I would give to what is needed is there needs to be a little bit more of a interconnectedness between the EU level and the national level, because if we see innovative approaches coming on at one level, but those demands, because of the nature of how you solve environmental and climate issues, cannot be solved either only at the national level or at the supranational level. I want to also go back to a little bit of why are innovative approaches a good idea, or why even, if I can be a little bit provocative, why even is more democracy a good idea when we talk about climate and environment. And I think it's very clear, especially when we see innovative approaches, and we were involved in a Horizon project called The Real Deal in the past, where we learned a lot about this, because we don't usually do research, so we need to learn from people who are researchers, is that when you take a subsection, a random selection of society, who may have not predominantly voted in the last national elections for green policies, but you take that random sample and you put them in a room and you ask them questions about environmental issues, more likely than not, you will get answers or recommendations that are in favor of positive environmental policy. So I think that's, from an environmentalist perspective, why innovative approaches and these direct democracy models, things like that, are very interesting, because they tend to give us more a stronger argument in favor of stronger environmental policy than when we just look at ballots every 4 years or 5 years. So that's the big why. For me, also, one part of the solution of what are the sources of the innovation we need is a little bit goes a little bit the other way, because when we look at participation, we have the rules-based things. So there is I was introduced already by Louisa, I work a lot on the Aarhus Convention, so we have minimum standards for public participation. If you look at environmental impact assessments, things like that. Karin, also you mentioned the national energy and climate plans. There are minimum standards in there for public participation. So these are rules-based. But then we have the innovative approaches, which usually don't have a minimum standard set in law that says this is why you need to have this, and therefore we have to have them. And I think it's both a weakness and a strength. The weakness is, well, if it's not based in law, then political sway will dictate whether these are being held or not. If it is based in law, if you codify all of these, you risk creating tick box exercises, or what we kind of we like to use the term citizen washing in these things, where you just put a bunch of people in the room and then have a nice press conference, although you never attended the event. That's something that is problematic. But I think in terms of sources for innovation, I think ironically a source for innovation has to be also the rules-based approach, going back to that and saying the line in the sand was drawn. Public participation is a minimum standard, and at the very least you have to do that, and then let's see how we can build on those and have those minimum standards be fulfilled in an innovative way. And I think there again, the national energy and climate plans, and also now the national social climate plans that are coming up, or that are coming up this June, although most member states will likely be delayed in delivering them. I think that's a great example, because in some countries, I mean, across the board, if you look at the national energy and climate plans, across the board there have been issues with public participation, huge issues. Some of them have never carried out anything. But we also see a couple of glimmers of hope here and there, where several countries have said, well, actually, if we have to do this anyway, might as well make it a little bit more fun, might as well make it worth our while. And it has given some civil servants in member states the necessary arguments to ask for budget, to ask for money, because everything costs money. If you have to have people, if you put people in a room, and we know that in person works better than online, somebody needs to pay for that, and somebody needs to organize that. And I think that's also one of the other sources. We have the rules-based sources, we have financial sources. This needs to be always put in there. We now have at the EU the discussion of the multi-annual financial framework. This will not be a major point in there, right? You'll try to add a few words or lines here and there, or that's our job to try to do that as lobbyists. I think I want to quickly talk about one or two obstacles to throw them into the mix of the issues we're currently facing. I think there is a little bit of a trend. Sure, the political majority has gone a little bit away from the heydays of the European Green Deal, and we see some of these things where also at the EU level procedures are being used that are less likely to create or give space for participation, or less likely to create a space for innovative approaches. We've seen all these omnibus packages, and if somebody knows the grammatically correct plural of omnibus, please get in touch. But we see that public participation of things that are normally set in line in the better regulation agenda from the Commission, there's a way around them, so you don't have to have them. We also see that, for example, there were the simplification roundtables, where a lot of industry actors were invited. The EEB, my colleague Margarita from my team, managed to get a seat at the table. In the end, she wasn't even allowed to speak. But then the press output in the end, or if you read the big pages-long communication of the Clean Industrial Deal, it says after consultation with stakeholders such as industry and civil society. And then you ask yourself, well, yeah, civil society was technically there, but there was no interaction had with them. Going back to citizen washing right there, or in this case, probably not citizen washing because we're lobbyists. So whatever you want to call that. I think I want to give one quick anecdote on obstacles, because we work on a project trying to help environmental defenders who are at risk. It's not directly related to public participation, but we held an event in Budapest in Hungary in this project with our local partners who are member organizations. And we had organized this months in advance, and it just happened to fall on the exact week where this Hungarian transparency law broke the news, and there was big threats around this, and obviously then the whole discussion had to be had around that. But there are some, scary things when one sits here, or I sit here in Brussels and I work on these things, and I get to hear from my colleagues elsewhere, and I need to seriously ask myself, is it still okay to do this event, or is this, morally questionable that we have to fulfill this project KPI? In the end, it was all fine, everybody's fine, it was a good event, nobody's been threatened, but just the fact that I had to ask myself that question is a situation I wouldn't like to be in. The last thing I want to say in terms of the sources of innovation, I think one of the big sources is also the role of academia, pushing the space for this, setting standards of how innovative approaches can be held, toolboxes, guidelines, best case examples. This is what somebody has done in one country, this is what people have done in a city, in a municipality, in a region. You can replicate it, here are the resources, here are the experts that do this kind of stuff. The great space for academia in this is that, yes, also academia needs funding, but if I look for resources on how to do an innovative approach, write any of the ones, if I want to do a roundtable or what may it be, academic resources are for me or for practitioners usually for free when I find them online, right? So I then don't need to pay a lot of money to try to get that expertise in the room, although if you do pay the money, your event will be better, because experts are always better to have, because people have experience in running these types of events. So to round it up, I think sources of innovations, going back to the rules-based, not forgetting about that line in the sand that was drawn with minimum approaches, banging that drum and not being okay with that goalpost being pushed. That's what was agreed upon. Until those laws are changed through radical political, agreements, that's what we still agree with, regardless of what the political majority is. That's what we've decided we would do, and the rule of law still holds. So we go that way, and using that as an inspiration. Secondly, money. You need funding for these type of things. Otherwise, you end up running an event that isn't great, and people become disenfranchised afterwards. And lastly, I think the role of networking together and getting the expertise, having the recommendations, toolboxes, and best case examples is one way to spur those things as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll hand straight over to you, Ben, to add to this. Thanks.
Thank you, and very interesting points that were made already. I'll pick up to some of those. First of all, maybe, and then I'll get to my actual point. First of all, rules-based. You discussed a bit the trade-offs between the rule-based and the more experimental approach. I think we're at the stage at this point, in terms of knowledge that we have about citizen participation, in terms of the amount of experiments that have been taking place, that the rules-based approach is absolutely the way that we need to go. Also precisely because of the risks that you have described. One other example, the Conference for the Future of Europe, this huge deliberative citizens assembly-based exercise, which was basically an 11-headed dragon because there was so many different side processes linked to it. Also at a part where the member states could contribute to it, but there were no minimum standards whatsoever, which meant that countries like Belgium did a citizens assembly well organized according to the rules of the game, so to speak, whereas other countries, and I'm not going to name them, just brought 10 experts together around the table for a nice lunch, and then the participation box was ticked. So I think if there's no rules, then the ticking box risk also becomes bigger. Also, think about this. It's as if you would say, hey, you're willing to build a car, so that's nice. Here are some guidelines that you can follow if you want. No one would do that. So for citizen participation, I think we also need a sort of enforceable minimum standards. So that's one thing. Getting to my actual point, and I promise I won't go over time, there's basically two challenges that we are facing, or several challenges, but two challenges that I want to point out today that we are facing in this democracy and climate governance issue. And that's, first of all, policy-wise, and you know this better than I do, we're not hitting our targets. We're not on the right trajectory. The Fit for 55 program was a good first step, but there's a lot of backlash against it, both publicly and politically. So a lot of work still needs to be done. And secondly, and this has already been briefly discussed, but I'll be a bit more radical, Western democracies are in the worst crisis since the Second World War. If you look at research data longitudinal over time, you see all indicators slowly going down. In Europe, or Western Europe at least, it's still being more stable than in other parts of the world, but still this is the context in which we have to work. And then we are trying to get more ambitious climate policies in a system, representative democracy, that's not designed for this. Representative democracy, elected politicians, institutions that we created in the 19th century are focused on nation-based types of decisions that need to be taken and relatively short-term decisions that need to be taken, whereas climate policy is exactly the opposite. It transcends boundaries, it's long-term types of thinking. And then, well, I'm executive director of an organization that promotes democratic innovation, so it's no surprise to you that I say that this is actually one of the things that could be really helpful. I think it's for two reasons. First of all, citizens can do more long-term thinking if they are recruited, particularly in these randomly selected citizens' assemblies that you have also just discussed, that can create a long-term vision that politicians have more difficulty to attain to because of the electoral cycles that are going. And the second issue that can be addressed with this is the crisis of representation, so to speak. Citizens do not feel represented by their elected politicians anymore, but if they know that citizens like them have been sitting around the table, that will create trust in the system, and that can create a basis for stronger democracies, but also broadly supported climate governance. And there's research that actually supports it. On the policy basis, Frederik has already mentioned it. Research has shown that if citizens are explained the trade-offs, they tend to come with more ambitious proposals than governments would actually do. One of the most famous citizens' assemblies that has been organized was the Convention Citoyenne pour le Climat in France, commissioned by Macron. The citizens there came up with some very unpopular but also ambitious proposals, limiting the speed on the highways, very symbolical but still caused a lot of dissent, from 130 to 100. No regional flights in France anymore. If a government would come up with such a program, they would be slaughtered. But the Citizens' Assembly, and there was a survey being done on this where they asked the French population, do you agree with these proposals of the Citizens' Assembly? 82% of French citizens said that they supported this outcome. 82%. That's political support that governments can only dream of. So that's really something, I think, that shows the potential of these initiatives to create broadly supported climate policies. I'm looking at my phone to see if I have gone through my talking points. Yes, I think I will end here for now, and maybe we can circle back to some of these things.
Thank you so much, both Ben and Frederik, for those really thought-provoking points about exactly the interconnections, I guess, between what we might want to call a democratic innovation and what we might call more traditional forms of democracy, and how the two might support one another, but also those really interesting points on the importance of sort of underlying rules. Very super interesting, I think, also for our public, our opening up for the Q&A shortly. But before we do that, I'd like to turn to Camila and this other big theme, the one we haven't talked about that much yet. When we think about democracy and the Green Deal, and that's the just transition, right, which brings justice into the question. So how can we ensure that the EU takes action that isn't just democratic but is also just and justice oriented, and maybe there, of course, we need to think beyond the EU as well, because, you know, there are big questions about where the just transition starts and its scope, let's say. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me start by saying that it's a great pleasure to be here with you today. I work as the Secretariat of the Advisory Board on the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change. And I will try to frame my answer to this very big question based on the work that was delivered by the Advisory Board so far, but also will frame it a little bit in the context of my own reflections. I'm originally from Poland. I studied law there, and I also am very much in favor of all that, Green Deal-NET work, and this is everything that I think is advancing democracy and is exactly the kind of initiatives that we need. The advice of the Advisory Board goes beyond the just transition in the sense of compensation of negative distributional issues. It has highlighted regularly the need for participatory and deliberative mechanisms of climate governance. It also roots climate policy very firmly in EU values and principles. And on those I would like to touch a bit today, the principles and values such as the rule of law that was mentioned today, and the solidarity and the human rights. So I will complement this foundation of the Advisory Board with some insights from courts and legal scholars, and also just to point to three citizen-centered questions that I genuinely ask myself quite often. First would be then to start with, do we as citizens, but also as institutions representing their citizens, do these institutions and citizens have access to credible information? So we all rely on media and science to understand climate change and policy, but media often reaches us first and more directly. So I think it's important to recognize that democratic legitimacy of climate policies depends on that informed public, that the public that engages in societal debate that Sebastian mentioned this morning, and that obviously goes beyond elections. So if we understand that there is more to democracy than voting and majoritarian preference, as highlighted by Ben, then we can get to the reasoning of some legal thinkers that a democracy needs to be reasoned and principled. And with this, we understand also that public sphere that is flooded with falsehoods is just not meeting the very conditions of democratic deliberation. Advisory Board has recently flagged that climate misinformation and disinformation is a growing threat to gaining trust and support of citizens that Karin talked about. And it's not just about misleading them, it undermines trust in science, institutions, and democracy itself. So credible information needs institutional safeguards, including funding, but also proactive countermeasures against disinformation. And these measures need to rely on science too, for instance, psychological research. And institutions, whether in their executive, legislative, or judiciary branch, they also need credible information, which brings me to my second question. Do we as citizens have access to justice, and to justice that is informed by fact and credible information? Access to that independent, impartial court is fundamental to both democracy and justice. Climate litigation, especially strategic climate litigation, is increasingly used to push for adequate climate action where it is missing. But its impact depends on judicial independence, as well as access to information, sufficient resources, and legal standing of civil society, to basically seek protection of the rule of law. And in this sense, the rule of law is not just a constraint on majority power, it is also an expression of the will of the majority, even if that majority was a different majority and at another time. So take, for example, the Paris Agreement. It's a globally legitimate binding commitment that requires the EU and its member states and other global partners to act on a collective challenge that cuts across every domain of life and law. And this climate crisis, I think it's good to frame it as it is, because it's probably the most profound human rights challenge of the 21st century. And already today, and even more so in the future, it produces innumerable human rights victims. So when that is taken into account, we understand the growing climate exceptionalism, which is fundamentally about the rule of law and protecting human rights, and especially human rights of those who are at representational disadvantage, such as children. So courts, judiciary can and provides already effective legal protection, even against governments. Cases like Klima Seniorin and Neubauer demonstrated very well, and the judiciary's role in protecting the underrepresented reflects a commitment to democracy that is not just majoritarian, but also pluralist. And that brings me to my third question, because if access to justice helps EU defend its values and principles, the rule of law, intergenerational justice, pluralism, then it basically defends it against the political short-termism that is caused by political representation that tends to focus on current electorate, not the long-term needs. And then what are our shared values and what is just? I don't think I need to remind anyone of the treaties, but it's always helpful to look at the EU foundational values enshrined in the primary law. Article 2 of the Treaty of European Union talks about human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, respect of human rights, including the rights of minorities. It also mentions pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality. So that gives us a little bit of a flavor of what just transition means. There's distributive justice that can be derived from these values, procedural justice, recognition justice, intergenerational justice. There's a lot of justice there. And yes, climate action is not automatically just. It must be designed and implemented in a way that respects these dimensions. So to sum up, I think how to ensure that climate action is both democratic and just, I will only add a very small brick in the monument that GreenDeal-NET is building. It's to combat disinformation and keep on delivering, spreading and using credible science and information, protecting democratic institutions and procedures, importantly rooted in our shared moral commitments, and perhaps recognize, a bit like Karin already said, that democracy is an ongoing experiment. It is never complete, and it relies on this continuous dialogue among citizens, institutions, and principles. And as the EEB director recently reminded in an open letter, stronger democratic indicators consistently align with stronger environmental outcomes. So with this, I would like to just say thank you to GreenDeal-NET, and I really look forward to the future work that the network will carry on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camilla. So it's a great note to move on to a kind of, I guess, a lightning round we were talking about in the in the coffee break before we started, which I'd like to ask each of you in like maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes max to say something about the statement in a context of rising backlash and backsliding around climate and sustainability policies. How can the EU move forward in democratic ways? And I'm thinking about statements that might then be an excellent way of opening up Q&A with the audience and bringing in other people's points of view. So, well, why don't we go backwards? Why don't we go start with Camilla and move backwards to Karin, if that's okay with you?
Sure. So the question is about the backlash and backsliding. So everything that is worrying us very much. I would then repeat. We understand where the backlash is coming from. It's from economic anxiety. It's this political polarization. We see it very much in Central Eastern Europe. So I think even though I represent the Secretariat of the Advisory Board on Climate Change, I would still think that we should not double down on environmental policies as such. It's doubling down on defending the rule of law and democratic institutions is a very important aspect of that climate ambition that the EU has. So safeguarding independent media and scientific integrity, ensuring inclusive participation in policy making, and guaranteeing meaningful access to justice, I think is very important. And obviously other aspects such as designing policies so that they are socially responsive and addressing inequality, energy poverty, rural, urban divide, all of that, things that make people feel treated in a way that probably pushes them towards more economic anxiety is something that is very important. So I think that sums it up. Thank you.
Super concise. Thank you so much, Camila. So now I'll come back into the room again and we'll have Ben and then Frederik. Thanks.
Great. I think we need to build better democracies that actually allow us to tackle issues like climate change. And for me, that does not mean that we need to replace elected officials with citizens. I think that would be highly unproductive. But I think you need to use each system what it's good for. I think elected politicians will need them always to keep running the show, basically. There's so many decisions that needs to be taken. Elections offer a very low effort, low strength possibility for citizens to participate in the political process, and politicians are also often great communicators, which is necessary in each democracy. Citizens then, I think, can come in about the long-term value-based decisions that need to be taken. For me, that means I would never ask citizens, hey, how should we best construct a nuclear power plant? But what you can ask them is, should nuclear energy be part of the energy mix of the future? Because it's a value-based political decision, and the trade-offs is something that people can understand. And I think we should build these democracies at all levels of government in Europe, and maybe the EU could even play an advocating role to work with randomly selected citizens' assemblies at the global level even, which is, I think, a really interesting scene because there is no overarching global government system. So maybe, weirdly enough, that may be an area where there is room for other types of decision making and other roles of citizens, which I think will be really crucial as well, particularly linked with this policy domain.
I'm going to try to mention 4 points in 2 minutes, but I think I can do this. First off, I would agree with Ben, building long-term elements into the system, because myopia in terms of elected officials is what the system is built in right now, and innovative approaches can be an avenue for that. Another avenue can be things like future generation commissioners and elements like that. Secondly, I would say it's important for each individual working in these areas not to succumb to the narrative. What happens is an attack is launched, and then people who are not directly subject to that attack are expecting more attacks in the future, or are expecting what they usually do not to be successful, and therefore lower their standards or their ambitions. And that includes all of us, and that includes people like the organization I work for. I think it's important to not let that goalpost be pushed until it has been pushed. So fight until the last minute. I think, thirdly, and that's an appeal to all the academics in there, environmentalists are the weaker party when it comes to trying to influence decision making. We like democratic approaches because they come up with more environmental outcomes. We usually end up being successful in lobbying because we have the moral high horse, because we have the facts behind us. When it comes to political science and democracy, it's much more difficult to show something as a fact than when you come to the hard sciences. So if academia can help us show long-term studies and say, see, they have done the work, these are facts that I'm supporting here, innovative approaches do work, that really helps us. And I think lastly, and that comes back to the point on access to justice that Camila also mentioned, and to the rules-based approaches, remember that public participation can be an avenue to court later on for access to justice. A lot of elements, a lot of landmark decisions, the only reason why the substance was discussed in the end because there was a procedural because citizens were involved in the decision making. So that's something to keep in mind for the future as well. Thanks.
Everybody's being fabulously brief. This is great. Karin.
Yes, thank you. So I will have 3 points, hopefully. Yes, I'm looking at my clock in 2 minutes. So one more ideational, one more institutional, and one more material. And first, on the ideas and narratives, as was mentioned by my fellow panel members, this misinformation, science, denialism, anti-net zero populism, and ideological polarization that comes from the right that are very good at communication, that has to be consistently fought with evidence-based policy making, science education at all levels, communication and awareness, and ways to engage the public. So that's very central. Secondly, to create a narrative of co-benefits between climate, security, and economic concerns. Secondly, institutional, I agree with my fellow panel members. We need more experience with citizens' assemblies on various levels. But still, a bit of caution. We need a balance between reform. It cannot replace representative democracy. We need to reform and innovate representative democracy both in the EU and national level, because there is this risk of what we call enclave deliberation, that deliberation is just limited to very small echo chambers. Finally, the material dimensions mentioned here. We cannot, doing this large-scale transformation in a democratic way, we have to recognize there are losers of decarbonization. So really through just transition and various mechanisms such as a social fund, compensate citizen, address the distributional issues of decarbonization and put them at the forefront. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe before I open the floor, we can just have a quick, we can thank all of our speakers for the work they've put in so far. Okay, so we have 2 questions online, and everyone in the room, get your hands ready to shoot into the air. So the question is, has the EU indeed retained the Green Deal in the von der Leyen Commission? Is the Green Deal still with us? I think the point is here. Because we're seeing a retreat at the rhetorical level, going from green to clean, the industrial deal, so that sort of recentering, I guess, of competitiveness, green growth, etc. And also in practice with Rearm Europe. And I'll also read the second one, and then we can see what your reactions are. Actually, I'm sorry, Ben, extra work for you, but you've got a question particularly for you, thanking you for the points and asking, in your experience, are you aware to what extent climate skeptics participate in citizens' assemblies, and how do group dynamics in climate assemblies influence and consider dissenting voices? So she's saying policy recommendations that I've seen from CAs are quite uniform, but we know there are dissenting voices in the public, so that backlash element. How can we involve those folks and have those very difficult conversations, I guess. So so the first question again is more about, is the Green Deal still with us, particularly with Rearm EU, etc. And then one there for Ben. So I don't know who'd like to come in on the first one. Yes, Frederik.
I think on the first one, sadly, yes, the Green Deal is dead because it was supposed to be a deal, and for a deal you need multiple people to agree or find a compromise. So the Green Deal is dead, but all the advancement in environmental policy that were the result of the Green Deal are not dead, and I don't expect them, even in the worst case scenario, over the next 5 years or however many we have left, they're not all going to die. This is not in the interest of the Commission, it's also not in the interest of the parliamentary majorities, and it's also not in the interest of the member states. So the framing of the Green Deal is dead because there's no more deal, but the policy advancements are still with us and will be for a very long time.
Anybody online want to come in on that one?
I'm maybe a little bit more optimistic, but of course I agree with both the question that the Green Deal is definitely, how should I say, there are more loopholes, it's under attack, it's weakened, and given the majority in the European Parliament, we will see a shift. And I also agree that I don't know if it's dead altogether, but it's passed along since 2019, so maybe. But we see a weakening, a delay, a kind of also in many, like in the omnibus proposal, delays, weakening, loopholes, and this I think in the next years we will see. And of course the overriding concerns of competitiveness and security is taking the forefront. So maybe not completely dead, but under attack or weakened.
Okay, then maybe I'll come to you, Ben, for your question.
Yeah, thank you. I'll very briefly, if you allow me to just have a bit more, a lot more about these issues than I do, but from my outsider's perspective, and you also discussed this, Frederik, and I have the impression that it's the narrative in general about these issues that is changing. Whereas a few years ago, things like sustainability, but also democracy, and the value of engaging citizens in policy-making processes was sort of broadly accepted as something that was in common. Now, the narrative is a lot more transactional. Now you have to prove that sustainability will lead to economic growth. You have to prove that these processes will be more efficient. And the same with citizen participation. You have to prove now much more often that it will lead to better outcomes, that it will be cheaper in the end to do these things. So I have the impression that that narrative is changing and that there's a commonality between democracy and sustainability. As to the question that was raised specifically to me, indeed, climate skeptics do make up a part of the public. I would also be cautious, and it's important that they are integrated in these processes, let me stress that a lot. I would also say, however, that research shows that quantitatively speaking, it's a relatively small part of society that really defines us climate skeptic. That being said, they should absolutely be included in the discussions, and it's a bit more of a technical solution, but one way that climate assemblies are often doing this is by asking citizens when they say, oh yes, I would maybe be interested in participating in these assemblies, to ask them the question on how concerned they are, for instance, about climate change, or how they position themselves on that sort of spectrum. And of course, people that are a lot more concerned about climate change are a lot more eager to participate in these things often. But if you do the recruitment process right, through the two-stage lottery, I wouldn't go too much into that, there are ways to make sure that these voices of the climate skeptics are also represented at the table. And indeed, by engaging them in a dialogue, by also giving them a chance to speak, because these things are also about values, that's important. But you counter You juxtapose that also with evidence that is being presented. Well, there is global warming. There's no denying it. There's different ways that we can deal with it, and these are the ways that we can deal with it with pros and cons. So there are ways to do it, and I think it's of huge importance that remains the case. One final point, and I promise to be brief. Research has actually shown, interestingly speaking, that citizens' assemblies are the most supported by the people who have the least trust in government. So the people who are the most frustrated about politics, with the least faith in politicians, are the biggest advocates of this. Why? Because they feel that, it's people like me who are around the table. I actually trust those people more than those elected politicians who don't have any idea about what it's like to have my type of life. So actually, these can be even powerful tools precisely to get those people around the table and to get more trust by those people in democratic processes.
Thank you so much, Ben, for answering that. So, folks in the audience.
So many interesting points made. I'm a bit spoilt for choice which one to pick up on. But I'm going to choose the one that you made, Fred, about not sort of letting the goalposts go until they're pushed. Because I'm quite concerned that we're in a bit of a boiling frog situation where standards are being sort of pushed back and back and back. And I suppose my question is are we doing enough? Is academia doing enough? Is civil society doing enough? Are the European institutions doing enough to sort of make sure that we hold the line on what are the sort of democratic fundamentals that we all rely on for environmental policy, but actually every other sort of good part of making a good society? So I'll be really interested in your thoughts on that. If there's time, if Ben was able to comment a little bit more on the global assembly or sort of global governance aspect and how that could be helpful for Europe as well, that would be interesting. But if there's time, thank you.
Thanks a lot for that question. I think it's a little bit of a question of optimism versus pessimism, and I think if you're working on environmental policy, you kind of inherently have to be a little bit of an optimist, or it's going to be very difficult to go through the day, I think. So I think that kind of gives an outset on the framing of what my answer would be. To the concrete question of are we doing enough? Or is politics doing enough? The answer is clearly no, because we have these indicators, they're going down. For environmental issues, we have targets that are being pushed further down the line. We no longer talk about prevention, we talk about adaptation. So part of society or part of politics is already okay with all the issues we're going to face due to climate and biodiversity crisis. So no, we're definitely not doing enough. But also, I think we need to stay optimistic with these values and know that if we keep those values and if we are able to keep them at the discussion table, it'll be much more difficult to have a wider consensus that goes against those values. So I think it's very important to keep reminding that and to keep the standards as high as possible until the very last moment where it's no longer acceptable, and then we move one step back, but we don't move 3 steps back immediately. I think that's the push has to be incremental so that then we can move forward again at the first opportunity. And the last thing I want to say is, that's the great saying of never waste a good crisis. It's a little bit difficult at the moment when one is following on the other, but we should also look out for the next one and be prepared that we use the next crisis to our advantage rather than just react to it.
I'll be very brief to allow other questions and other panelists also to engage. I think the main thing where a global assembly would be really helpful is the whole discussion on what's a fair sharing of the burden between all these different continents. The way that it's organized right now, the incentives are really blocking an open and just discussion about what the best way to do this in a fair way is. And I think that citizens, because they don't have these assemblies that they have to serve national governments and national interest and whatsoever, can really contribute to a much more interesting, broader, and I think far-aiming discussion about these issues.
had a question here from... sorry, Camila, yes.
I just wanted to add on what Ben just said about the fair share. So this is something that the advisory board engaged in 2023. They came up with the methodology of calculating what's a fair and feasible share of EU's carbon budget to stay within 1.5 and the Paris Agreement goals. Then it was picked up by the court in Strasbourg in the Climat Seniorinnen case as a kind of template for other governments also to use and calculate their fair share. So there is a little bit of that already on the climate side. I cannot speak on the environment side, but maybe just a word of courage here about this different narratives and whether the Green Deal is that. Even if the narrative shapes or shifts from green to clean, it does not weaken the arguments and the fundamental science behind the sustainability and climate action. This is what the advisory board in its very recent advice on the European climate law revision reminded in the very first chapter, is exactly this routing of why we're doing it, from physical science to those co-benefits for competitiveness and security. There is nothing to hide, and there is a very strong synergy, if not a fundamental input from environmental and climate policies. So even if narrative shifts, I think that doesn't weaken the arguments. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask a question inspired by some of Camila's comments around who the demos is, who we think the relevant actors are in European democracy, and how those whose voices aren't included can be included. So I'm thinking, for example, of non-citizens living in the EU, current generations elsewhere in the world affected by European policies, future generations, children and young people, and of course non-human nature. So any reflections from the panel on how the voices of those who are not included in our decision making can be? Thanks.
Thank you. Would anybody like to start on that? Ben? Yes.
So two things within citizens' assemblies, sorry that I refer to that again, there are often experiments being done with people that are precisely given the role, for instance, to play people from the future generations. That may sound a bit weird, maybe at first, and you may feel a bit uneasy at it at first, but actually people can really understand that role, they really grow into it, and this has already proven to be a very provocative role in these discussions. And secondly, maybe a bit more provocative, maybe AI can play in the future a role in playing that role. And I know there's huge risks involved in this, and I know that there are huge biases involved in this, but we don't know how quickly it's going, how this is going to be evolving in the future, and maybe there will be a time where that actually can contribute something useful to this discussion.
Anybody else? Karin, yes.
Thanks for that question. That is very interesting, and maybe EU also can learn from the United Nations, because and this links to kind of a stakeholder democracy idea. As you mentioned, future generation, non-human animals, and the other actors have a stake. And in UN, there is this organization of non-state actors in these 9 groups, but also debate. Youth, women, indigenous people, trade union, business, and a constant debate, why not, as you say, future generations, because the global stake in all groups that have global stake. However, it's a tricky thing, because when we talk about these different groups, there are, of course, and as a political scientist, we analyze interest groups, veto players. Some of these groups are such as we have a UN business, has and I've done work on interviewing all these different groups. They have so much more power and resources. So I think definitely EU could experience more and maybe formalize similar lines with UN, but it will be a debate on who should the groups are, and there are additional groups, disabled, many different groups, religious groups. So, but I think, thanks for that question. It's very relevant both for the UN, the global scope, and EU on how to define these those left out people who do not who have a stake.
Thank you. Hello, thank you for the discussion. My question is actually, Camila, you picked up the advisory board's fair share work, which I also have used in some of my work leading up to the 2040 target. And I wanted to ask if you see, because also linking to the earlier question about the rhetoric having changed quite a lot in relation to the Green Deal and sustainability, and now focusing a lot on the competitiveness and resilience, is there, with your law expertise as well, is there a way to make the fair share fair and feasible, as the advisory board has indicated, to make it stick more in the discussion? Because I have the impression that this is something that is very much discussed in the academic realm, but not really picked up by the policymakers. And I would like to have your take on that, if you've seen anything or if you see any anchors for applying that more. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. I cannot speak on behalf of the board, but I can speak on behalf of what I've seen in the surrounding discussions towards the latest advice, which reiterates the fair share methodology and the feasible methodology that was put forward in 2023. It was published in June, so on 2nd of June, we did our best in that publication to support advisory board in making the message stick. We also understand that the fairness aspect may be a little bit less sticky this time, but it is fundamentally about the rule of law, so the compliance with the Paris Agreement and the multilateralism and the respect of the rules-based order. And that is in the very interest of the EU, and I think this is across the spectrum of the European Parliament, to make sure that the EU is functioning in a world that is rules-based and that respects that. So maybe appealing a little bit to that it is not only about the moral responsibility, but it is also a legal responsibility to deliver on its fair share. That can be talked about in the context of international climate commitments of the EU, in which the EU is not only obliged and has a strong responsibility to support other jurisdictions, including developing economies, but on climate, but also to help them achieve their own NDCs. It's not only about external action of the European Union, but actually contributing to others meeting their highest feasible ambition. So in that sense, I think it was helpful to look at the fair share also from the legal perspective. On the feasible side, the indicators only are encouraging so for the moment on climate, on rollout of wind and solar, for instance, on flexibilities, and so technologically we are advancing. And that makes a stronger case for the 90% target to be achieved domestically, and that this investment will be flowing in the EU economy. And that is kind of a very domestic, maybe somehow selfish for the EU, but also very much in line with the interests of competitiveness and security. So the feasibility and fairness are two sides of the same coin, but the advisory board has not changed its overarching stance on this since 2023.
Thank you so much. We have to wrap it up there, but hopefully this is the beginning of another new network, and we've also received, as academics, quite a few instructions on what we need to do to help civil society and environmentalist civil society out. So that's been super useful. It's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you very much to our panel, both in the room and online, once more. And I believe we have a coffee break now, but let's thank the panel in the usual way. Thanks, everybody.